In chapter 24, we're going to look at the digestive system. So looking first at the anatomy of what the digestive tract is made up of, as well as accessory organs. So the digestive tract is everywhere we think about food moving through. So this is going to be everything from the mouth to the anus would be included in the digestive tract. So including things like the pharynx, esophagus, stomach, the intestines, and then out through the rectum. There are also accessory organs, though, that go along with the digestive system. It's not really part of the tract that the food would go through, but it's important in digestion. So we include things like the tongue and the teeth, different glands, the gallbladder, the liver, the pancreas, and all of these different glands that secrete digestive juices into the digestive tract to aid in digestion. So if we look at the major digestive organs, again, mouth, pharynx or the throat, esophagus, stomach into our small and large intestines, then to the rectum and then out through the anus. Whereas we have several accessory organs like salivary glands, again, our liver and gallbladder that are especially helpful for digesting lipids, as well as the pancreas. So the functions of the digestive system are to take in food, so ingestion and mastication, which is the chewing or the mechanical breakdown of food. Then we need the propulsion, which is moving it through the digestive system as well as mixing it. So again, propulsion is just the movement of the food, whereas the mixing would be included in taking things back and forth. So we think about propulsion movements, including swallowing or deglutition. This is the moving of this liquid in food, which is called a bolus, from that oral cavity through the esophagus. Then we have peristalsis, and this is the movement through that digestive tract. And this occurs in a wave that's provided by smooth muscle contraction and relaxation that moves that bolus and then into chyme. We'll talk more about that whenever we get to the intestines. That allow that digestive system to expand. And then that wave of contraction, we get the circular smooth muscles behind it that propel it forward. And then in the large intestine, we have what's referred to as mass movements. So the propulsion there, continuing that mixing then occurs in waves, as well as segmental contractions in the small intestine that allow for the mixing of the food with the digestive juices and the enzymes to break it down. There's various amounts of secretion. This is going to help lubricate that bolus so that it moves through, as well as liquefy and digest. So we think about mucus. This is going to occur the whole way through the digestive. Again, it's lubricating the food so that it moves, but it also lines and protects the stomach and the intestines from the digestive enzymes that are breaking proteins down, as well as from the acid that's released in the stomach. Water also gets released for liquefaction. Again, just helps the food move easier through that system. And then the enzymes that actually break down the food to release the nutrients that are in them. And then digestion includes mechanical, so again, mastication, the physical breakdown, as well as chemical from those enzymes. And then once those are broken down, they need to be absorbed. This is mainly in the small intestine, but that goes into the blood or the lymph in the case of most of our fats. And then ultimately elimination, which is the removal through the feces through a process of defecation. Now the histology here, so we have the mucosa. This is kind of the innermost, and there are 4 of these layers. So that comprises the mucous epithelium. So again, epithelium, thinking about the outside. So this is non-keratinized, stratified squamous. This is going to be in the mouth and then down through the pharynx, into the esophagus, and then simple columnar for the rest of the way through the GI. The lamina propria, this is made up of loose connective tissue. The muscularis mucosa is smooth muscle, kind of the name implies muscle, so knowing it's smooth muscle that helps with that. And that extends into the lamina propria in places where we have the glands or crypts. And then we have specialized cells that help with mechanoreceptors to control that peristalsis, the movement through it, as well as chemoreceptors that are going to help with chemical or the enzyme digestion. And then we have the fourth one is the submucosa. This is a thick connective tissue layer. This is where the nerves and the blood, also the lymph and small glands would be found. And then the submucosa plexus, or also Meissner plexus. This is a network of neurons and glial cells from the enteric nervous system, which is part of the nervous system within the digestive system, that's going to control the secretions from those glands. And then the esophagus and stomach, though, lack this layer, this submucosal plexus. Now, the muscularis, this is 2 or 3 layers of smooth muscle. Again, that's going to help with the peristalsis, help with the movement through the GI system with those contractions. So it contains the myenteric plexus between the circular and longitudinal layers. And it, again, allows movement through the GI. So within that plexus, though, there are what are called interstitial cells. They form a network of pacemakers that help with rhythmic contraction. So again, as we think about it moving in waves, not just a continuous movement, but again, there's kind of rhythmic contraction that pushes and propels the food through. And then again, as I mentioned, the enteric nervous system are just the submucosal and the myenteric plexus that contain those neurons that help with contraction, as well as the release and secretions from the system. And then the serosa and the adventitia, this is made up of connective tissue. So where the visceral peritoneum is present, it's called serosa. And then where the outer layer is made up of more connective tissue is called adventitia. So just whether or not that visceral peritoneum, I struggle with that word, whether it's found or not. All right, and this is just looking at those 4 layers. So again, we have the mucosa, the submucosa, the muscularis, and then the serosa that make up the 4 layers of that digestive tract. And then each of those, again, are epithelia being in the mucosa layer there, and then those muscle layers found within the muscularis, hence the name, and then more connective tissue in the serosa. So regulation of the digestive system. So just like with the respiratory system, we have local regulation as well as general regulation. So locally is that enteric nervous system. So there are sensory, motor, and interneurons that are all contained within the digestive system that coordinates peristalsis and some local reflexes. More generally, though, including this entire central nervous system, we initiate those reflexes based on sight, smell, and the taste of food. Mainly this is parasympathetic, so rest and digest is our parasympathetic system. So digestion is mainly controlled by parasympathetic neurons, but there are some sympathetic inputs that inhibit muscle contractions and secretions, as well as decrease blood flow whenever, again, that fight or flight, we're not worried about digestion. So sympathetic is going to inhibit that digestive system. Now, the chemical regulation, we have neurotransmitters, of course, within that local or general system. So the main ones are acetylcholine that stimulates the enteric nervous system, and then norepinephrine is our fight or flight. So epinephrine is going to inhibit it. Also, serotonin stimulates digestive motility. So about 95% of the body's serotonin is actually in the digestive system. And then various hormones that we'll talk later on, like gastrin and secretin, get released as well to help. And then there are parachemicals like histamine that can get released for local reflexes that control the condition. So like the pH levels within the stomach that are controlled through those paracrine chemicals like, again, histamine. All right, so if we move to the peritoneum, double layer, we have that serous membrane that goes the whole way through. So visceral peritoneum covers our organs. Parietal covers the interior surface of the body wall. And then we have what's called retroperitoneal. And this is just with certain organs that are covered by the peritoneum only on one surface. So it's considered behind the peritoneum, so retro meaning behind. So for example, the kidneys and the pancreas, they have their retroperitoneum. It's only on one side or one surface. Peritonitis is inflammation of that peritoneum. And then ascites, this is accumulation of serous fluid in that cavity. We also have what are called mesenteries. So these, again, 2 layers of mesothelium with a thin layer of loose connective between them. So we have what's called the mesenteric root, and this is where the mesentery attaches to the abdominal wall. And then this includes the routes where vessels and nerves are going to pass into the organ. So these mesenteries are kind of like tunnels or connections between those blood vessels and those neurons into the various organs. And there are 6 different regions that make up the abdominal mesentery. And 2 of those domains include the mesenteric domain, which is that visceral peritoneum, and the non-mesenteric, which is the parietal peritoneum. There are what are called omentum. So we have the greater and the lesser, as well as the omental bursa. So the greater is a double fold of this mesentery, connects the greater curvature of the stomach to the transverse colon. And then the lesser, again, we have connective tissue here. This is going to be for the curvature of the stomach to the proximal part of the duodenum, and then to the liver and diaphragm that connect those. And then the omental bursa, this is the cavity between the 2 layers of the mesentery. And then there are 2 ligaments of the digestive system, the coronary and the fulcrum. So the coronary is between the liver and the diaphragm, and then the fulcrum is between the liver and the abdominal wall. And this is just showing those places. So again, our lesser omentum here, the greater omentum, and these are connections again between the stomach. So again, the curvatures here of the stomach to again to the liver here with the lesser, and then to the small intestines here with the intestines with the greater omentum. And then we also have, again, our mesentery here, that is those various connective tissues that are found there. And then we have also, as part of that, the right mesocolon. So again, just showing this kind of connective tissue here in yellow that allow for connections between the different organs of the digestive system. Now, if we start in the oral cavity with our digestive tract, so this is bound by the lips and the fauces, which are the opening of the pharynx. We have what's called the vestibule, which is the space between the lips and the cheek, and between the lips and the cheek and then the teeth. So there are some various medicines that can be given there in the cheek. It's called the buccal administration. So that would be in this space. We also have the oral cavity proper, which is just medial to those alveolar processes. And this entire cavity is lined with non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. Now, the lips and the cheek are important for that mastication, that mechanical breakdown, as well as for speech. So the lips are the labia. Here we have the orbicularis oris. This is the muscle within the lips that's made up of keratinized stratified squamous epithelium on the exterior. And then the color of the blood in the dermis gives it that pink kind of reddish color. The labial frenulum, this is the folds there of the mucus. So this extends from those alveolar processes of the maxilla and mandible, so our bones there of the jaw, to the upper lips. And then lots of different facial muscles that are involved in moving those lips. And then our cheeks, of course, the lateral walls of the oral cavity. One of the muscles here, the buccinator muscle, flattens the cheeks to allow for that mastication. And then we have what's called the buccal fat pad, and this goes around the cheek profile. Then we also have the palate. So we have a hard and a soft palate. So this separates the nasal and oral cavities. So the hard plate is anterior, helps support the maxilla and the palatine bone. The soft is on the posterior region. This has skeletal muscle and connective tissue. That uvula, which is the little thing that hangs down, projects from that posterior portion of the soft palate, and then those fauces, which are the posterior boundary of the oral cavity. And then also at the back there, we have the palatine tonsils. So remember, the tonsils are divided into 3 parts. So the palatine is there on the lateral walls of the fauces. The tongue here is a muscular part of the oral cavity. So it has a free anterior surface, of course, attached to the posterior surface. It's made up of stratified squamous epithelium. There are intrinsic muscles there that help change the shape, as well as extrinsic muscles that protrude or retract the tongue or move it from side to side. We have the lingual frenulum that attaches the tongue inferiorly, so below, so to the floor of the cavity. The terminal sulcus, which is the groove that divides the tongue into the anterior 2/3, posterior is about 1/3. And then the anterior part has those papilla, which are part of our taste buds. The posterior part, we don't have any of those papilla and no taste buds back there. Just a few scattered ones. And then the lymphoid tissue is embedded in the lingual tonsil. And ultimately, the tongue is used to move the food in the mouth, as well as helping with speech and swallowing. The process of mastication is just the chewing, which is including with our teeth, so our incisors and canines that are going to bite or cut the food, and then our premolars and molars grind the food. Different muscles involved: the masseter, which kind of goes along with the name, the temporalis, and medial and lateral pterygoids. And then we also have what's called the mastication reflex. This is controlled by the medulla oblongata in the brainstem. But that descending pathway from the cerebrum provides conscious control. And then we have this mastication reflex controlling basic movements involving our chewing. Now, the salivary glands, there are 3 pairs of these glands. So we have the parotid, the submandibular, and the sublingual glands. These are the 3 main pairs. There are other glands as well. The parotid are the largest. So this is contained of those serous. They're just behind the ear, just anterior to the ear. That parotid duct crosses over the masseter, one of the main muscles used for mastication, goes into that buccinator, and then into the oral cavity around our molars. Then the submandibular has a mixed type of gland, but a little bit more serious than mucus or mucosis. So the posterior half and the inferior border here of the mandible is where we find it. And then the duct enters on either side of the lingual frenulum. And then finally the sublingual, which is the smallest of the glands. Again, mixed composition, but mainly mucus. And then each has about 10 to 12 ducts that come into the floor of the oral cavity. These glands are kind of compound acids that produce saliva, hence their name, salivary glands. So the function here of this is to produce what's called salivary amylase that helps with the breakdown of starch. So that starts in the mouth, as well as lingual lipase, which starts the breakdown of lipids. So starch and lipids are both beginning to be broken down in the mouth with the saliva. Proteins not until we get to the stomach. So the saliva helps to form that bolus, again, that lump of food, but it helps lubricate it to allow for easier passage. And then our parasympathetic input through the facial nerve and the glossopharyngeal cranial nerves is what causes the production of that saliva. And then higher brain centers can also respond to smell, thoughts, and the sight of food. So the protective functions then of saliva, so the large volume just helps prevent bacterial infections in the mouth. So it kind of washes away the oral surface so that the microbes can't attach. It also forms bicarbonate ions. We talked about this a little bit in our respiratory system, but the bicarbonate ions help to buffer and neutralize any acids that are made by the different bacteria in our mouth. And it also helps to reduce bacterial acids that would impact tooth enamel. So it helps neutralize that acid. The saliva also has lysozyme and immunoglobulin A. The lysozyme breaks down bacterial cell walls, and the immunoglobulin A prevents against different bacterial infections. So kind of part of our immune system, again, helping to protect against infection because there's so many microbes on the foods that we ingest. And then the mucus of the saliva helps to protect the digestive tract from being broken down by the enzymes that are breaking the food down. We want to break the food down, but not our stomach or our small intestines. So the mucus helps to protect those layers. And then any reduction of those secretions increases the risk of ulceration, as well as infection of that oral mucosa, as well as cavities forming in the teeth. So then moving into our swallowing. So now we're moving into the pharynx. So again, we talked about the pharynx before with the respiratory system, but we have the oropharynx, the laryngopharynx that make up the digestive system. So they're shared between the digestive and the respiratory system. So both of those groups have muscles called the pharyngeal constrictors that allow us to swallow. And then that epiglottis is very important to cover the larynx to keep food or drink from going into the lungs. So then from the pharynx, it travels into the esophagus to transport everything to the stomach. So it passes through what's called the esophageal hiatus, or the opening of the diaphragm, and then it ends at the stomach. So if somebody has a hiatal hernia, it's the widening of that opening. And it has a lot of kind of regurgitation, acid reflux kind of thing that can be happening, some choking that can occur as well. There are also a couple sphincters here in the esophagus. So there's the upper sphincter that's made up of striated muscle, and then the lower, or that is striated, and then the lower that is smooth. And again, that's just going to help prevent movements of the food going back or forward before they're ready. And then again, mucosa here is moist stratified squamous epithelial to make that thick layer of mucus to protect the lining of the digestive system. So there are actually 3 phases of swallowing. It's not quite as easy as one would think. So there's the voluntary phase. This is where it's moved by the tongue from the cavity to the pharynx, so that voluntary control. Then we have the pharyngeal phase, which is a reflex. So this is controlled by the swallowing center in that medulla oblongata. So what's going to happen is that soft palate elevates, the esophageal sphincter relaxes, the pharynx opens into the esophagus, and then it is pushed down by those pharyngeal constrictors, so that successive contraction of those moves it into the esophagus. Then the epiglottis is going to be tipped posteriorly to prevent it from going to the lungs. And then we have the esophageal phase, which is another reflex. So the only part that's voluntarily controlled is the first part. And this is that stretching of the esophagus that causes the enteric nervous system to start the peristalsis. So that, again, coordinated kind of wave of muscle contractions to move that bolus through the esophagus. Once it leaves the esophagus, we move into the stomach. So this is that enlarged part there, the GI tract, that helps with storage and a mixing chamber. We have a few different regions of the stomach, the cardia, which is where the esophagus opens into. The fundus is just to the left and above the cardia. The body of the stomach is the largest part. This is where those greater and lesser curvatures are found. And then the pylorus, made up of the pyloric antrum which is the widest part, the pyloric canal that opens into the small intestine through what's called the pyloric orifice. And then we have two sphincters here as well. We have the cardiac, which is the lower esophageal, and the pyloric sphincter that then opens into the small intestine. So again, our main parts, so we have the cardia part, which is where the esophagus empties into. We have the fundus here at the top. Then the body is the main part with our greater and lesser curvatures. And then we move into the pylorus part with this pyloric sphincter or esophageal sphincter is here at the top as well. So the different layers of the histology of the stomach. So we have the serosal visceral peritoneum, that's simple squamous, the muscularis, which is made up of 3 layers, the outer longitudinal, middle circular, and inner oblique. Then we have the submucosa and the mucosa. So again, we mentioned these before, these various layers. And then there are also what are called rugae. And these are folds of the stomach when it's empty that have mucus and submucosa that allows stretching as the stomach is going to fill. And so again, just looking here at these different layers. So again, our mucosa layer on the outside, submucosa, and then the muscularis that form the 3 layers of the stomach. Now, the stomach is involved in various secretions. So hydrochloric acid, of course, the stomach's very acidic. That is released by parietal cells. And its job of that hydrochloric acid is to kill bacteria. Again, lots of bacteria coming in on the food we eat. But it also stops carbohydrate digestion by inactivating that salivary amylase that was released by the salivary glands. It helps to denature proteins, which just means losing their shape. And then it converts pepsinogen to pepsin, which is one of the hormones, one of the digestive enzymes for proteins that starts there in the stomach. Intrinsic factor is also released, also made by those parietal cells. This is going to bind to vitamin B12 to help it be absorbed. And vitamin B12 is essentially, or especially essential for producing our genetic material that helps for cell division. Mucus is also released by the stomach. Again, like we've talked about, that's going to help protect the stomach from the acidic enzyme, from the acidic hydrochloric acid that's released, as well as from the enzymes that are released. So again, irritation of this layer causes greater mucus to be released. And then we have the various digestive enzymes. Again, pepsinogen we just mentioned. We have packaged with what are called zymogen granules that get released by exocytosis, and then pepsin catalyzes the breakdown of proteins, breaking those peptide bonds. And then we also have gastric lipase that starts to, or continues to digest our lipids. Now we move then from bolus to chyme. This is the ingested food plus those stomach secretions. So the bolus comes through the stomach. Once it mixes with everything in the stomach, we now have chyme. So if we look at some of the different hormones here that get released, so gastrin gets released by the stomach, is going to increase gastric secretion. So again, releasing more hydrochloric acid, more mucus, more pepsinogen, and more of those hormones. Secretin gets released by the duodenum. It allows for the acidity of chyme is what's going to kind of stimulate that, but it's going to decrease those secretions and stimulate the pancreas and bile secretions that are high in bicarbonate to help neutralize that acidity. And then CCK is also released by the duodenum. This slightly decreases gastric secretions, but it stimulates pancreatic secretions that help with the breakdown of food, also contracts the gallbladder and helps relax the sphincters to allow for a decrease in gastric motility, just allowing more time for the food to be broken down. So secretin and CCK are both decreasing motility the gastrin is going to have a slight increase on the motility.